There seems to be an influx of cards in Magic the Gathering that make cards uninteractable, giving them unblockable or hexproof. Lost in the Maze in Standard makes it so Konas can't be interacted with once they're tapped, and you even have Kappa Cannoneer in Modern and Beyond being unblockable. But many of these cards actually serve to be better designed than what Wizards had in a previous template. That is to say, Menace is better than unblockable, even though it feels like it's the same. And Ward is much better than hexproof, even though sometimes it also feels like the same depending on the ward cost. Many of these card designs are improvements in many ways that players aren't necessarily aware of, and I wanted to talk about that today. There's a lot of interesting discussions to be had around design of Magic cards, and I do want to give my hats off to Wizards of the Coast for improving such designs. I think in the previous eras of Magic, even pre-Fire design, there was a lot of blanket effects, cards that were just untouchable, and you would print them at a lot rarer of a pace. Whereas now we have slightly more nerf versions, as many would consider, but ones that have more interesting design space, as in the possibility space of interacting with them and how you can abuse them. Cards are now much more interesting to play against and play with, and that is thankfully seen through cards like Menace or cards with something like Ward. And the first example I want to bring up primarily is going to be with Grief. And with something like Grief, you have the straight up ability of Menace, a card that is banned in Modern, banned in Legacy. This is no video advocating for the return of a card like this. But when it comes to something like Grief, coming down on turn 1 and in the Legacy format being able to be reanimated, and in the Modern format, a soft reanimation effect, it just made it so the next time that it would hit the graveyard, it would come back. You now have a turn 1 card that was able to take your opponent's hand completely apart, but now is kind of unblockable in the early turns of the game because very few ways exist to create multiple creatures on turn 1. Very few decks have the capacity to create multiple creatures on turn 1 to even block out this Grief, and then you are playing a black deck in Grief. You probably have fatal pushes or some amount of removal for opponent's said creatures. But that doesn't mean the plan of blockability isn't there. The key is that you can still reasonably at some point not only destroy said creature, but you can also play to the board to be able to eventually block this creature. And what's great about the Menace ability is that it's not necessarily an inevitability. It is in the early game with something like Grief specifically, but you do have to remove certain creatures and create block scenarios where your opponent is forced into certain blocks. And that's kind of that first interesting piece, or I should say the second. The first interesting piece is that your opponent does believe that when you play that Menace creature, that they can now play to the board. They don't have to change their game plan or do something completely different. But when it comes to even the blocking idea of it, because your opponent knows that they can block, they will choose to block, and that can be a soft way to get cards off the battlefield and out of your opponent's hand. Traditionally, with an unblockable creature, maybe with something like Kappa Cannoneer, a card like this does not look to ever be blocked. Your opponent will never consider ever blocking this. In the rare scenario, of course, in your affinity deck, where you don't have a artifact in hand or an exile to be casted once it's warped, you can block the Kappa Cannoneer, but in many ways, this card will never have that because the decks that Kappa Cannoneers run in is designed for that to never happen. And so this card almost always functionally has unblockable. You are looking to remove this. You are looking to outpace it. You are looking to stave it away with something like an Ensnaring Bridge out of the Karn the Great Creator package. And the play pattern of playing against Kappa Cannoneer is obviously much different than Menace, even though many people consider it to be the same. Again, in many scenarios where Grief is played, and that is an extreme example, a card like that is functionally unblockable. You could even take it to an extreme case with something like Troll of Khazad-dûm that has Mega Menace, as I like to call it, where it can only be blocked by 3 or more creatures. And a card like that functionally has unblockable when you consider 1v1 matchups in the grand scheme of things, but it doesn't mean that it's completely unstoppable, especially when it comes to something like the Pauper format, where you do have ways to gum up the board and create a bunch of tokens. Something like Troll of Khazad-dûm Reanimated actually does pose a threat, but not that much of a threat. You can block. You can create scenarios where you can buy time against it while it's chipping away at you, and you find a way to eventually remove it. And so when it comes to the difference with Kappa Cannoneer, that unblockability shuts out a whole gameplay pattern. It makes it so your opponents have more cards in their hand, and they likely won't even play out a creature plan to board to even block it unless that creature plan is central to their plan and is about overwhelming your opponent. Think about something like Yawgmoth combo in Modern, where yes, you are going to play out creatures to be able to create a toolbox package in your board to sack and block and gain more life, gain more cards, whatever it is. You are going to play to the board there. But maybe something like a 5-color humans deck may not want to bother with doing that when it comes to blocking. They may play cards that prevent you from casting spells or grabbing your hand, but they won't do so exclusively with the purpose of trying to block that Kappa Cannoneer. But what they will do when it comes to something like Grief or Troll of Khazad-dûm, or cards similarly with Menace or Menace style effects, they may try to gum up the board to be able to block, because that is a thing the deck is great at when it comes to something like a humans deck, a creature-based strategy, something like Merfolk, something like Goblins, whatever it is. Those decks can create a wide board presence, and they will look to block that because that is within possibility. But because that is within the possibility of what your opponent can do, you are also aware of that as the Grief player, as the Troll player, and so you will hold up removal for that. Whereas the Affinity deck will go more all in on something like the Kappa Cannoneer. It will play a land into a Pinnacle Emissary, play a bunch of 0-drop artifacts, and then poop out a Kappa Cannoneer, and yes, be empty-handed and can top deck a bunch of lands, but if those lands are artifacts, then that Kappa Cannoneer is unblockable. You can then cast the Pinnacle Emissary that you warped in initially and make it unblockable later. All this type of stuff. You can continue the pain train from there, and you are not necessarily as reliant on something like a Galvanic Blast or a hard removal spell to be able to clear the way because you know this is unblockable. The play pattern on your side is different, and the play pattern on your opponent's side is completely different, even though, again, for the third and fourth time, a lot of people consider the design or the, not necessarily the design, the play pattern of it in implementation is very similar to each other. Menace is functionally unblockable if you build around it, but it really isn't because the design space is completely different. And that's where Kappa Cannoneer can actually be very similar to something like Ward versus Hexproof. Kappa Cannoneer having Ward 4 is almost untargetable. The key to that is almost, because when it comes to untargetable, there's a big difference between that and Ward. Ward allows you to target that creature. When it comes to unblockable in Kappa Cannoneer, you cannot block that ever. You can never put creatures in front of it if it is unblockable in its status. Whereas something like Menace, you could put a couple of creatures in front of it. Like you can't put 1, but you can put 2. You can put 3. You can put 4. You can put as many creatures as you want in front of it, 0s or 0-1 or whatever, with any intention of blocking it in any way, shape, or form. But when it comes to something like Ward versus Hexproof, a card that is Hexproof, a permanent that cannot be targeted, like Lotus Field, or a card that is on the battlefield that has a Veil of Summer effect underneath it, cannot be targeted with a removal spell or any point of interaction. When it comes to something like Ward, I can target the Kappa Cannoneer with my spell. It's just gonna get countered, right? That's the key to it. I have to be able to pay the ward cost or the card disappears. And this is where the design space gets interesting. Because when it comes to something like Kappa Cannoneer, if your card is uncounterable, that spell's going to resolve. The ward ability does not matter anymore. It is not uninteractable anymore. It is better in terms of a design space than Hexproof. For the vast majority of situations, it is the same thing. But Wizards is able to now replicate a scenario where we have Hexproof, a functional for the majority of the time, 90% of the time, similar effect. But in the niche scenarios where you have certain pieces that are uncounterable, or situations where you do want that card to be countered that you're casting, you now have a way to take your opponent's tool and use it against them. So again, that level 1 is the fact that you can actually target the ward card. I can target the Kappa Cannoneer. If I have an uncounterable spell, then I'm going to be able to remove that. I can bounce it, whatever it is you are doing with that Kappa Cannoneer once you target it. But then once I'm able to use cards to a certain ability, what's nice is that certain cards have different ward costs. Hexproof is a uniform effect. It just cannot be targeted. Shroud is that level up where even you cannot target that card if it has Hexproof, if you are the control of that card. So for example, Lotus Field, I can target with my own lands, such as with something like a Thespian Stage in Pioneer Lotus combo. But when it comes to my opponent, they can't Field of Ruin that said Lotus Field. And so they're not going to be able to remove that, but I am able to double it. But if Lotus Field had Shroud, which was probably the better decision for it if you came to balance, the card itself would probably be just completely bad. It would not be a great land whatsoever, and it would then be untargetable by you and set effects. And certain decks would just not exist altogether. The decks that look to Twiddle Storm the lands altogether, or again the Thespian stage strategies in Pioneer. You would not be able to do this with Lotus Field. But when it comes to something like Ward specifically, certain Ward effects are differing to help with design, in the sense of, think of like a permanent that has Ward discard a card. Think of like Graveyard Trespasser, a card that, yes, if you top deck a removal spell, you will not be able to destroy that Graveyard Trespasser because the ward cost requires you to discard a card. But what's nice about that is if you're in a Reanimator strategy and don't have a discard outlet, Graveyard Trespasser, now you're able to use to your advantage. You can cast a removal spell on it, and then you can discard a card to be able to then further reanimate something down the line. Your opponent's ward cost, that functional hexproof, is now used against you. Now, Graveyard Trespasser, a little bit easier of a ward cost than most. Kappa Cannoneer, notably, having ward 4 is a lot harder of a price to pay, but not a price that is unpayable. If you have a Path to Exile in the late game as a modern control player, for some reason you might be playing Path to Exile, who knows, and you target that Kappa Cannoneer, you probably can pay that for an instant speed late game. If your opponent has a Kappa Cannoneer that late in the game, great for you. And if you survive that long, you probably deserve it against the Kappa Cannoneer, because it's unlike a Slippery Bogle. Because a Slippery Bogle, we know, a classic strategy, having just cheap hexproof creatures that are 1/1s or whatever it is, and they come down and you put a bunch of enchantments on them and they gain trample, +1/+1, +10/+10, like just insane amounts of power toughness with some abilities that allow them to be unblockable in some way to get around, whether it be flying, trample, menace, or unblockable, quite literally. The hexproof creature is largely uninteractable, and that is where we get edict effects, cards that force your opponents to sacrifice a certain creature, and that is how you're able to get around not only the hexproof effects, but if you look at something like a hexproof effect that forces you to choose, I'm forgetting the name of it right now, maybe someone in the comment section can let me know, but it's the edict effect that forces your opponent to sack a non-token creature, a token creature, and then like something else. Those are the type of effects are really cool, and they're a design space that's worth exploring. But now with the ward, you can almost, yes, still play those effects, because the edict effect is going to be effective against Kappa Cannoneer in a vacuum, but it's really not at large because the Kappa Cannoneer player has probably cheated that out by playing multiple other artifact creatures, whether that be Ornithopters or just 1/1 0 drops. So you are not going to have to, you're going to have to work a little bit harder, I should say. You are not going to have the effectiveness you want out of an edict effect that you would against a Bogos creature. Now, we do have cards like Nowhere to Run, which is a more recent addition out of black that makes it so you can give a creature -3/-3, but as long as it's out, your opponent's creatures, they don't have hexproof and you can target them like that. So we are gaining effects that can do this. We even see this in something like the 1-mana artifact tutor out of Urza Saga packages. I'm forgetting the name of this again, where you can activate for 1 and creatures and permanents your opponents control lose indestructible and lifelink. So it's a way to remove that ability out of all permanents, maybe indestructible lands or something like hexproof out of lands, and then you can like target them or something. And so when it comes to an effect like that, that's really powerful, being able to be tutored out of an Urza Saga package. And now you have something like Nowhere to Run that isn't necessarily tutorable, but is an answer to hexproof. But instead of printing answers to like hexproof, and it's important to give creatures hexproof because that can now be treated as an ultimate effect, as a level down for kind of design, we can now give ward. And that's why I think designs like this are so important. Hexproof versus ward, Menace versus Unblockable. Yes, all of them are very different by definition, but a lot of players feel like they are the same. They feel like when they play against them that they ultimately end up the same way, nothing changes, and they aren't able to interact anyway. But really, that's not true. There are probably lines that you can go about to stop either version. Versus Hexproof and Unblockable, you may be shut out completely and you have to take a different route, whereas you might be Faithless Looting away certain cards that you don't want, or opting cards to the bottom that traditionally would have been good against creatures you are now putting to the bottom. But against Ward or against Menace, you might actually choose to keep some of said removal spells because you know you can get to a late game far enough where the ward cost is payable. You feel like you can put enough creatures onto the board where that menace isn't that problematic and you can turn the tides in your favor. And that's why design space like this is so important. And I just wanted to put a video out there talking about this. This video was inspired largely by a tweet from Alex Nikolic talking about how Menace is low-key such a brilliant mechanic. And I kind of expanded on it. I thought it was actually a really great topic to kind of break into here. A lot of these things, I think a lot of people understand subconsciously, but they haven't spoken out loud. It's important to understand why Wizards is making designs like this, because it gives more control, not only to the player playing it, but also to the opponent trying to answer it. It allows more possibility space, allows for more answers and more counterplay. And that's the beauty of Magic. Not only the deep layer system and the stack, but also your ability to be interactive. Many card games these days come about not only trying to fix our mana system, but don't have that interaction level. They're always trying to simplify things because they treat it like Magic is too complicated and that, it is a negative to the game to have such depth. But to have that level of control can only be a positive thing. To give that much onus to a player, to allow them to have that much ownership in their decision making is key. And that comes not only from the cards that you make, but the individual keywords that you give said cards and how you change that keyword over time and maybe adapt it to slightly different versions. And not everything is going to be a slam dunk, manifest and manifest dread and, the subtle differences between the two. Not everything is going to ring in everyone's mind as a great difference and a upgrade to a previous effect. But there are cards that really do shine through the rough, and there are designs that I think deserve a pedestal to be seen at. And that's what I wanted to use this video for, to kind of talk about today. So a little bit of a different video here, not going through my regular slideshow of cards, and I really could have, but I wanted to kind of rant, or not rant actually, positively talk about a couple of design space cards that I thought were really interesting. So I hope you enjoyed videos like this. Let me know in the comment section if you want to see more of stuff like this. There's always thoughts on my mind like this, and it's not always just Twitter drama and Reddit reacts here on the channel. But for now, let me know how you're feeling about Unblockable versus Menace and Hexproof versus Ward. I am playing creatures of multiple types in all of those abilities. I am playing the Mega Menace Troll of Khazad-dûm. I'm playing my Bogles and Pauper. I'm playing my Kappa Cannoneers in my affinity decks, and I'm playing my Lava Spur Boots and all that stuff. I am playing the interesting stuff, and I know many of you are as well. Have you been enjoying it?